lower something heavy, a bag from the counter to the floor, a grandchild from your arms to the ground, your own body from standing to seated. Feel the muscles in your thighs working, not pushing, not lifting, but braking. The muscles are lengthening under load, getting longer while resisting the force that is stretching them. And in that moment, the lowering, the braking, the controlled descent, those muscles are generating more force than they generate when they do the opposite and lift you back up. That statement sounds wrong. Muscles are supposed to be strongest when they shorten, when they contract and pull bones toward each other. Every anatomy diagram shows the same image, the biceps bulging as it curls upward, the fibers shortening, the force generated by the act of getting shorter. The entire language of strength is built around the shortening phase: lifting, pushing, pulling, pressing, curling. Every word implies muscles getting shorter to produce force. Lengthening should be the weaker direction. Lengthening should be the passive phase where gravity does the work and the muscle simply follows along, controlling the descent the way a brake controls a car rolling downhill, necessary for safety, but not where force is maximal. Lengthening should be the easy part, the part you do not think about, the part that happens between the efforts. Measurement says otherwise. A muscle lengthening under load produces 1.3 to 1.8 times more force than an identical muscle shortening under load. The stair script established this fact, each downward step producing more force per fiber than each upward step. The fact is not new. What was never explained is why. Why would a muscle generate more force in the direction it is being stretched? The answer lives inside a molecular structure that was not characterized until 1979, a protein so large it was named after the mythological giants, and the mechanical principle it reveals reverses everything the textbook picture of muscle contraction implies. The muscle is not simply resisting during the descent. It is deploying a second force generator that only activates when the muscle lengthens, a molecular spring that contributes nothing during shortening and everything during the controlled lowering that most people perform too fast to feel. When a muscle shortens under load, concentric contraction, it generates a measurable peak force. When that muscle lengthens under load, eccentric contraction, it generates approximately 1.3 to 1.8 times that peak force. The ratio varies by muscle group. The quadriceps show approximately 1.4 to 1.6, the plantar flexors approximately 1.3 to 1.5, the elbow flexors approximately 1.5 to 1.8. The variation reflects differences in Titin isoform expression and fiber type composition, but the direction is universal. Every muscle tested produces more force while lengthening than while shortening. Eccentric advantage is not a laboratory artifact visible only on sensitive equipment. It is large enough to determine which daily tasks remain possible and which become impossible as strength declines with age. The threshold force required to rise from a standard dining chair is approximately 60% of maximum concentric quadriceps strength. When concentric strength declines below this threshold, the person cannot stand up unassisted, but the eccentric capacity for that person is 1.4 to 1.6 times higher. The descent to the chair remains comfortable even when the ascent has become impossible. The mathematics are concrete. A person whose concentric quadriceps strength has declined to 55% of its peak value cannot rise from a standard chair unassisted, but their eccentric strength at 1.4 times that concentric value, approximately 77% of peak, still comfortably exceeds the descent threshold. The lowering is easy and the rising is not, an asymmetry that is arithmetic, not perception. It is the arithmetic of two force generators versus one. You can measure this on a dynamometer in any rehabilitation clinic. Ask a person to extend their knee against resistance, concentric quadriceps contraction, and record the peak torque. Then ask that person to resist a force that bends their knee, eccentric quadriceps contraction, and record the peak torque. The eccentric measurement is consistently higher in every population studied. In adults over 60, the gap is often larger than in younger adults. Eccentric strength is preserved better with age than concentric strength. A 70-year-old may retain 85% of their eccentric quadriceps strength from age 30, while retaining only 70% of their concentric strength from the same baseline. The capacity to lower is maintained while the capacity to lift declines, and the divergence widens with every decade past 50. By 75, some adults have lost enough concentric strength to struggle with rising from a low chair while retaining enough eccentric strength to lower themselves to it smoothly. You know the asymmetry from daily life even if you've never named it. The person who struggles to stand from a low chair but lowers themselves to it without difficulty is demonstrating the eccentric advantage in real time. The concentric capacity has declined below the task threshold, the minimum force required to extend the knees and hips against body weight from a seated position. The eccentric capacity, which started higher and declined more slowly, still exceeds the task threshold for the descent. The lowering is easy because the muscles are genuinely stronger in that direction. The rising is hard because they are genuinely weaker. This asymmetry is not a curiosity. It is an opportunity you have been wasting with every fast, uncontrolled descent. The muscles are strongest in the lowering direction, and every time you drop into a chair in 1 second instead of lowering in 4, you bypass the loading phase where the muscle is best equipped to adapt. The fast descent skips the stimulus. The slow descent captures it. The textbook model of muscle contraction, the sliding filament theory developed by Huxley in the 1950s, predicts that muscles should generate maximum force during shortening. The model is elegant in its simplicity. 2 sets of protein filaments, thin actin filaments and thick myosin filaments, overlap inside each sarcomere. The myosin heads project from the thick filament like oars from a rowing shell. Each head attaches to a binding site on the actin filament, rotates through a power stroke that pulls the actin approximately 10 nanometers toward the center of the sarcomere, detaches when ATP binds to the myosin head, reattaches to the next binding site, and cycles again. Each cycle generates approximately 4 piconewtons of force and moves the filament 10 nanometers. Hundreds of myosin heads cycling simultaneously, sarcomere produce the macroscopic force, the remnants. More cycles per second means more force. Maximum cycling rate occurs during concentric contraction, when the filaments are sliding in the direction the cross bridges are designed to pull. The model predicts concentric as the strongest direction because it is the direction where the molecular machinery works as designed, each cross bridge performing its power stroke in the intended direction, each cycle adding force to the previous cycle's output. During eccentric contraction, the filaments are being pulled apart in the opposite direction of the power stroke. The myosin heads are still attached to actin, but instead of pulling actin inward, they are being forcibly stretched apart as the sarcomere lengthens under external load. The myosin head clings to the actin binding site with an affinity determined by the electrostatic and hydrophobic bonds between the 2 proteins. During the concentric power stroke, the myosin head releases from actin voluntarily. ATP binds to the myosin, weakening the actin affinity, and the head detaches to begin a new cycle. The release is controlled. The force produced is the work output of the power stroke rotation. During eccentric lengthening, the detachment is forced. The external load pulls the actin filament away from the myosin head before ATP-mediated release occurs. The myosin head resists. The bonds stretch. The binding site distorts under the tensile load. The force required to mechanically rip the crossbridge apart to overcome the binding energy holding myosin to actin exceeds the work the crossbridge produces during its own voluntary power stroke. Each forced detachment is a miniature tug-of-war between the external load and the crossbridge binding affinity. The binding affinity wins longer than the power stroke pushes. This is why eccentric force exceeds concentric force at the crossbridge level. But the cross-bridge resistance alone does not explain the full 1.3 to 1.8 factor. If forced detachment were the only mechanism, the eccentric advantage would be approximately 1.2, the ratio between the binding energy in the attached state and the work output of the forward stroke. The additional force that pushes the advantage from 1.2 to 1.8 comes from a structure the sliding filament theory originally ignored entirely. Now, the evening I lowered myself from a kitchen chair in 4 seconds. Deliberately slow, deliberately controlled, feeling the quadriceps burn intensify at the halfway point where the knee angle reached 90 degrees and the mechanical disadvantage was greatest, I understood the paradox in my own body. The lowering was harder than sitting down normally. But it was not harder than standing up from the same chair. The muscles were producing more force during the descent than they could produce during the ascent, and the burn at the halfway point was the dual mechanism demanding fuel and oxygen at a rate the concentric phase never approached. The lowering felt like more work than the rising. The physics confirmed it was. You know the measurement and the cross-bridge paradox that partially explains it. The question changes from how much stronger the eccentric phase is to what produces the additional force the cross-bridges alone cannot account for. The answer was discovered in 1979 and required 40 years of subsequent research to fully characterize. Titin is the largest protein in the human body. A single Titin molecule spans half the length of a sarcomere, from the Z-disc at the sarcomere boundary to the M-line at its center, a distance of approximately 1 micrometer. For a protein, this is enormous. Most proteins are globular, folded into compact spheres a few nanometers across. Titin is a linear chain stretching across a distance 1,000 times its own width. Wang and colleagues discovered and characterized it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 1979, identifying the molecule through gel electrophoresis as a band so large it had been dismissed as a contaminant by previous researchers. The molecule contains approximately 34,000 amino acids in a single chain. For comparison, hemoglobin contains 147. The chain folds into a series of immunoglobulin-like domains connected by flexible linker segments, each domain a small globular structure approximately 4 nanometers in diameter, strung together like beads on a wire that extends the full half-length of the sarcomere. The name comes from the Titans of Greek mythology, the giants who preceded the Olympian gods. The protein earned the name through sheer molecular scale. For 2 decades after its discovery, Titin was classified as a passive structural element, a molecular scaffold holding the thick myosin filament in position within the sarcomere, preventing lateral drift during contraction. Structural scaffolding, a molecular tentpole and nothing more. Subsequent research, particularly by Wolfgang Linke and colleagues at the University of Münster, established through a series of single-molecule mechanics experiments, culminating in physiological reviews in 2018, revealed that Titin is a molecular spring, an elastic element that generates measurable restoring force when stretched, with mechanical properties that change depending on the magnitude and velocity of the stretch. During eccentric contraction, as the sarcomere lengthens under load, Titin stretches. The stretch begins in the PEVK region, a segment of the molecule rich in proline, glutamate, valine, and lysine residues that acts as an entropic spring, extending like a coiled telephone cord being pulled straight. At low stretch magnitudes, the PEVK region provides most of the restoring force. The force increases gradually, proportional to the stretch, following the physics of an entropic spring whose resistance comes from the reduction in conformational freedom as the molecule extends. At higher stretch magnitudes, the magnitudes that occur during a controlled 4-second chair descent, the immunoglobulin-like domains begin unfolding. Each domain is a small globular structure held together by hydrogen bonds between beta sheets. The domain resists unfolding up to a critical force, approximately 100 to 200 piconewtons per domain, as measured by atomic force microscopy in single-molecule experiments. When the force exceeds the critical threshold, the domain unfolds in a sudden event. The hydrogen bonds break, the beta sheets separate, and the domain extends from its folded length of approximately 4 nanometers to its unfolded length of approximately 28 nanometers. Each unfolding event absorbs energy, the mechanical work of breaking the hydrogen bonds, and generates a sawtooth pattern of force, rising force, sudden extension, brief force drop, then rising force again as the next domain approaches its unfolding threshold. Across the full Titin molecule, dozens of immunoglobulin domains unfold sequentially during a controlled eccentric contraction. The cumulative force is substantial, the sum of the PEVK entropic spring force plus the sequential domain unfolding forces across every Titin molecule and every sarcomere in every loaded muscle fiber. This passive elastic force adds directly to the active cross-bridge resistance, producing the total eccentric force the muscle generates during the descent. The total eccentric force is therefore the sum of 2 independent components: active cross-bridge resistance to detachment, the myosin heads resisting being torn from the actin filaments, plus passive Titin elastic restoring force, the molecular spring stretching through its immunoglobulin domain unfolding sequence, 2 force generators operating simultaneously. Concentric force has only one component: active cross-bridge power stroke, the myosin heads pulling actin inward through their rotational cycle. Titin is slack during shortening. It contributes nothing. The spring only generates force when stretched. This is the molecular explanation for the eccentric force advantage. During lengthening, the muscle has two force generators. During shortening, it has one. The muscle is not trying harder, recruiting more fibers, or receiving stronger neural drive. It has an additional mechanical element, a spring, that only contributes force in the lengthening direction. The 1.3 to 1.8 factor is the arithmetic of two generators versus one. Well, eccentric contraction produces more mechanical damage to the sarcomere than concentric contraction at equivalent workloads. The forced detachment of cross bridges and the unfolding of Titin domains create micro-disruptions, small tears in the Z-disc structure, disorganization of the myofilament lattice, and localized membrane damage that allows calcium to leak from the sarcoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasmic reticulum into the cytoplasm. This damage is the stimulus for adaptation, not an injury to be avoided, but a signal the muscle requires to rebuild stronger. The calcium leak activates calpain proteases that initiate controlled degradation of the disrupted components, selectively removing the damaged sarcomere segments while leaving the intact segments in place. Satellite cells, the muscle stem cells residing in a quiescent state between the sarcolemma and the basement membrane of every muscle fiber, detect the damage through signaling molecules released from the disrupted membrane. They activate exoquiescence and begin proliferating. The satellite cell response is the rate-limiting step in muscle adaptation after 50. Satellite cell numbers decline with age, the pool of available stem cells shrinks, meaning each activation event draws from a smaller reserve. Eccentric loading activates more satellite cells per repetition than concentric loading because the mechanical disruption is greater. This makes eccentric training disproportionately valuable in the aging muscle. It maximizes the adaptation signal per repetition from a cellular population that has become scarce. Activated satellite cells donate nuclei to the damaged muscle fibers. Each donated nucleus provides an additional DNA template for protein synthesis. More nuclei means more messenger RNA produced simultaneously. More messenger RNA means more ribosomal translation occurring in parallel. The repair does not merely restore the original architecture. The satellite cells do not rebuild what was there before and stop. They overbuild, adding additional sarcomeres, increasing myofibrillar protein content, and producing a fiber that is slightly larger and stronger than the pre-damaged fiber. A 4-second descent produces approximately 2 to 3 times more muscle protein synthesis stimulus per repetition than a 2-second rise. As Roig and colleagues confirmed in their British Journal of Sports Medicine meta-analysis, and then the age advantage. Adults over 60 lose concentric strength faster than eccentric strength, and the divergence has a specific neural explanation. The primary driver of age-related strength loss is motor neuron death. Alpha motor neurons, the nerve cells in the spinal cord that send the signals commanding muscle fibers to contract, die progressively after 50. The death is not uniform. The largest motor neurons, which innervate the fast-twitch type 2 fibers that produce the highest forces, die first. Each death removes an entire motor unit from the recruitable pool, one motor neuron, and all the muscle fibers it innervated, sometimes hundreds of fibers per neuron, gone from the force-generating capacity permanently. Some of the orphaned fibers are re-innervated by neighboring surviving motor neurons, a process called collateral sprouting. The surviving neuron extends axonal branches to adopt the denervated fibers, but the adoption is imperfect. The reinnervated fibers often convert from fast twitch to slow twitch, matching the characteristics of their new parent neuron. The muscle loses fast twitch capacity disproportionately. Concentric contraction depends heavily on rapid cross-bridge cycling, which requires high-frequency neural drive from multiple motor neurons firing in tight coordination. The loss of fast-twitch motor units directly reduces the concentric force ceiling. Eccentric contraction depends more on the passive Titin spring and on cross-bridge resistance to detachment, both of which are structural properties of the muscle fiber itself, present in both fast-twitch and slow-twitch fibers, and less dependent on the frequency of neural drive. The Titin spring stretches regardless of which motor neuron type innervates the fiber. The cross-bridge resists detachment regardless of the firing rate. The eccentric force generators are structural while the concentric force generator is neural. and the neural elements decline faster with age than the structural ones. A person over 60 who has lost 30% of their concentric quadriceps strength may have lost only 15 to 20% of their eccentric strength. The capacity to lower declines more slowly than the capacity to lift, a divergence that widens with every decade past 50 and becomes functionally significant by 70, when the concentric deficit may determine whether daily activities like rising from chairs and climbing stairs remain possible without assistance. This is why the controlled descent is the optimal training stimulus for the aging muscle. It loads the muscle through the capacity it retains rather than the capacity it is losing. The training stimulus meets the available capacity. The muscle can be loaded adequately to trigger the damage repair growth cycle without exceeding what the depleted motor neuron pool can generate. Anyone with a knee or hip replacement, active joint inflammation, or a balance disorder that increases fall risk during controlled descents should consult their physician before deliberately slowing their descent tempo. The sustained eccentric load through the full knee flexion range may exceed what the joint surfaces or prosthetic components are designed to accommodate under prolonged loading. Every descent against gravity is an eccentric contraction. The quadriceps lengthen under load when you sit down. Every chair, every car seat, every toilet, every park bench. The gastrocnemius and soleus lengthen under load when you step off a curb, each step down compressing the ankle through a range where the calf muscles break against the body's forward momentum. The biceps lengthen under load when you set a bag on the counter. The weight that felt heavy to lift feels manageable to lower because the eccentric capacity exceeds the concentric. The shoulder stabilizers lengthen under load when you lower something from a shelf, the rotator cuff and deltoid breaking the descent with the dual mechanism where the lift used only one. The hamstrings lengthen under load when you bend forward to reach something low, the hip extensors controlling the forward tilt of the pelvis against the mass of the torso. Count your descents for a single day. Chair sits, 8 to 12, stair descents, 5 to 20, depending on your home and workplace. Curb steps, 2 to 10, depending on your walking route. Objects lowered, 5 to 15 plates to the table, bags to the floor, items to shelves below shoulder height. Car seat entries, 2 to 4. The total is typically 20 to 40 eccentric loading opportunities per day. Every one of them currently performed too fast to capture meaningful adaptation stimulus. In a normal, uncontrolled descent, dropping into the chair in 1 second, stepping off a curb without braking, setting a bag down carelessly, the eccentric loading is brief. The Titin stretch is minimal. The cross bridges resist detachment for a fraction of a second. The muscle damage signal falls below the threshold for meaningful satellite cell activation. Both generators activate and deactivate before the sarcomere disruption can accumulate to a level the repair system detects. Slow any descent to 3 to 4 seconds and the physics changes entirely. The muscles are under eccentric load for 3 to 4 times longer per movement. The cross bridges resist detachment for longer. The Titin molecules stretch through more immunoglobulin domain unfolding events. The mechanical disruption to the sarcomere is proportionally greater. The satellite cell activation signal is proportionally stronger. The adaptation stimulus transforms from subthreshold to significant, not by adding an exercise but by changing the speed of a movement you already perform. Now, try it. Sit down from wherever you are. Take 4 seconds from standing to seated. Feel the quadriceps burn at the halfway point, the 90-degree knee angle where the mechanical disadvantage is greatest, where the moment arm of gravity through the body's center of mass is longest relative to the knee joint, and where the eccentric force demand peaks. That burn is the eccentric advantage. Cross bridges resisting detachment plus Titin stretching through its immunoglobulin domains, producing more load than the concentric rise from the chair will produce when you stand back up. The burn is the stimulus. That transformation, sub-threshold to significant, from a speed change applied to movements you already perform, is why I slowed every descent to 4 seconds. Sitting down, 4 seconds from standing to seated, the quadriceps controlling speed against gravity. Descending stairs, 1 full second per step rather than dropping to the next tread, each step a controlled eccentric loading event through the full knee flexion range, the eccentric load through the quadriceps, hamstrings, and gastrocnemius increasing proportionally with a controlled tempo. Stepping off a curb, controlled landing, ankle dorsiflexors and knee extensors breaking the descent eccentrically. Setting a bag on the counter, 2 seconds, the biceps and shoulder stabilizers lengthening under load through the full range. No additional exercise, no equipment, no allocated time. Every descent already in the daily routine becomes an eccentric loading event when the lowering is controlled. 20 to 30 daily descents slowed to 3 to 4 seconds delivers 20 to 30 eccentric loading events per day, each one producing the Titin stretch, the cross-bridge resistance, and the satellite cell activation that builds the contractile protein. The concentric phase can no longer adequately stimulate because the motor neuron pool that drives concentric contraction has been shrinking for decades. Eccentric training produces delayed onset muscle soreness, the stiffness and tenderness peaking 24 to 48 hours after unaccustomed loading. The first week of 4-second descents may produce noticeable quadriceps tenderness the day after starting. This soreness is not a sign of injury. It is the inflammatory response to the sarcomere microdamage that the forced cross-bridge detachment and Titin domain unfolding produced. Neutrophils and macrophages arriving at the disrupted Z discs to clear the damaged protein fragments and prepare the site for satellite cell-mediated repair. The soreness is the repair signal, not the damage itself. Soreness diminishes rapidly as the repeated bout effect establishes. This is a specific and well-documented phenomenon. The first bout of eccentric loading produces the most damage and the most soreness. The second bout, even at equivalent intensity, produces measurably less damage and less soreness. By the third bout, the muscle has adapted its sarcomere architecture to the eccentric demand. The Z-disc of reinforced, the Titin isoform expression may have shifted towards stiffer variants. The cytoskeletal connections between sarcomeres have strengthened. Subsequent sessions produce progressively less soreness with equivalent or greater adaptation stimulus. The first week is the hardest. By the third week, the descent feels normal. 3 to 4 seconds every descent every day. Both generators active in every controlled lowering, cross bridges resisting detachment, Titin molecules stretching through their immunoglobulin domains. Concentric capacity declines as motor neurons die. Eccentric capacity, carried by Titin springs and cross-bridge resistance that depend on structural protein rather than neural firing frequency, declines slower. The exercise your aging muscles perform best is the exercise you perform every time you lower anything against gravity. You have been performing these descents too fast to capture the stimulus. The molecular spring inside every sarcomere has been waiting for you to slow down enough to stretch it.